Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm very excited because today we're going to be talking with the rather wonderful Mr. Hugh Padgham. This is part 2 in a 3-part series. We're going to be touching on some amazing artists, so stay tuned with some lovely conversation with Mr. Hugh Padgham. I think you have the credit of being a whistler on this record. I'm assuming that's for Games Without Frontiers, seeing as it has the whistle in it.
Yeah, it's great. I even make money out of it now. How about that as a performer?
Well, I'll be sure next time I need a whistle to hire you.
Oh yeah, definitely a good whistler. And do you know the strange thing is, I mean, you have a different sort of thing going on in America, but in England, about 12, maybe even 15 years ago, producers were. This came through like a European law. Producers were basically regarded for the first time as a performer on the song, and so we now actually earn performance royalties as well as sales royalties or whatever other way you get paid, and so that was a really fantastic thing. I'm talking purely on mercenary terms here for producers who really, it's down to the producer and the engineer to make the song sound like what it sounds like when it comes out of the speakers on the radio or wherever. And so it's completely justified in my mind that we were now regarded and what's the word I'm trying to think of? Not allowed, but regarded as a performer. And so any record that you could prove that you played something on or whistled on or whatever, you now get performance income from. And in those days, I used to play something on every single record just for a laugh, whether it be a hand clap or a whistle, or used to sort of say, "Oh, come on, I'll bowl in and play the cowbell or something on it." But of course, you never ever got credits, nor did you ever think of it or asking for it. And so it was great when Peter did that, because it came back to be quite a good thing. It's quite funny. I don't know about you, but we just used to have a laugh and just say, "Oh, come on, I'll play something on that record just for posterity."
Exactly. Oh yeah, absolutely. When everybody's out there doing the clap track, yeah, that's awesome. Or just that late night. Oh, this needs some percussion when you're going to mix, and you realise you want to put like a shaker in to help the chorus move.
Yeah. So good hint now is always make sure you get to be credited for it as well.
Absolutely. So do you have any other recollections of that song? Because of course it's an absolutely insanely amazing song.
Well, I can remember Kate coming in the studio, and everybody quite fancied Kate,
for obvious reasons.
And so it was like, how often can we get Kate to come down the studio? I mean, I remember doing weird stuff with Kate, where she would learn to sing a line backwards. So say you've got the word "and," she would go "dna," say it backwards, and then we'd record it, flip the tape, so it sounded like "and," but backwards. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Towards the end of the song, the backing track goes into double speed. We turn the machine up to 30 IPS, but the vocals all stay the same.
Wow. How did you do that?
Her backing vocals are the same. How did we do that? With great difficulty, but I can't remember exactly how. It must have been done when we were mixing. I would imagine we must have turned the track up to 30 IPS, muted the backing vocals, recorded it onto 2 tracks of a multi-track, and then gone back and synced up by hand the vocals, her all the backing vocals, synced them up, and then mixed that down, and then edited it on. That must be how we would have done it.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Because going to 30 IPS,
Yeah.
you knew it was exactly twice the speed, so it would sit right if you got it right, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So it went from eighths to sixteenths. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a powerful song in so many ways. I mean, sonically, it's an absolute masterpiece. It's a feast for your ears. But of course, you know, it's another one of Peter's incredible vocals, Kate's incredible vocals, but the lyrics are just so moving.
Yeah, aren't they just?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that we used a lot on the record, when you hear distorted vocals and distorted guitars, we had this tiny little Radio Shack speaker that was literally, you know, not much bigger than the size of a large matchbox. And Radio Shack, it was what was it called over here? Maybe it was, you know what I mean by Radio Shack.
Yep.
And it was a little test speaker, and it cost $9.95. And I think Larry Fast had it for just, I don't know, tuning synths or something like that. And we realized it had the most fantastic distortion in it. And so it was nicknamed the 995. Oh, let's put that through the 995. So anything that we wanted this distorted sound, we would put into the 995, and I would just mic the front of it right up close with a Shure SM57 mic, and that is one sort of thing that we did a lot. It maybe sounds a bit crass to say you're fans of the stuff that you did,
I think it's perfectly
but
fine.
I mean, you know, I was big fan of XTC before I got to work with them. I was a big fan of Split Enz before I got to work with them. I was a big fan of Genesis before I got to work with them. You know, I mean, how much better can that be? You know, it really, I have to say my biggest stroke of luck ever was managing to get a job with Virgin in the late 70s and be at that studio, the Townhouse, when it just became the happening place, you know.
But I mean, you're also instrumental in that. You know, we talked obviously in the other interview, but we talked about, you know, the sound of Intruder. I suppose we didn't do the obligatory "Let's Talk About In the Air Tonight." I think we actually sort of skated past that because of Intruder. Even though Intruder was the birth of the sound, of course, most people watching this will know "In the Air Tonight" as being sort of the seminal version of that huge drum sound that you created.
Sure. One of the things of In the Air Tonight that we, going back to the Melt album with Peter Gabriel, which we of course only ever knew as Peter Gabriel album. Melt was only named afterwards to try and differentiate them all. Anyway, day one of working with Peter, he comes in the studio and he says to all of us in there, the musicians, I don't know, it was basically Jerry Marotta and Phil who played the drums, and I think Jerry Marotta was there on the initial sessions. And he says, I don't want any cymbals or hi-hats on this album. And it's like, okay. But for a drummer, not playing cymbals and a hi-hat was quite a big deal. And I mean, you listen to the album and you don't notice it at all, really, because, I don't know, sonically it's filled up with high frequencies and things as well. But it was such an amazing, I mean, why did Peter come in and say, I don't want any cymbals or hi-hats on a record? And he's like huge soul and Motown fan, and you know, we're all used to cymbals, and I suppose because we're all used to them, he suddenly thought, wow, I don't want it, I'm going to make a record with no cymbals. But the reason I'm saying that is because when we kind of did discover this drum sound thing for the Intruder, we very quickly realized that if you play cymbals in a loud room and you've got a lot of compression going on, which is what we talked about last time with the Listen mic, and compressed to death, plus other room mics compressed to death. As soon as somebody hits a cymbal, it just literally overtakes everything else, and it just becomes the most horriblest, hugest sort of mess. And it became very apparent that in order to get this good, loud, open drum sound, you literally couldn't play cymbals. If you wanted crashes, then or something to emphasize, you know, where you would normally play a cymbal, you had to really do it by overdub. And so with the In the Air Tonight drum fill as well, as you know, there's no cymbals in it. So that's, and people would come to the Townhouse to record drums and wouldn't realize this and didn't realize why they couldn't get a good sound, because you literally, you know, if you want that sort of sound, you can't play cymbals, and not playing hi-hat and you know, I think Jerry Marotta, I think we put up a fake hi-hat with pieces of foam rubber or something on it, because he didn't know what to do with his right hand, you know. And and I think the same with cymbals. We'd put something up just so that he could think that he might be able to hit it, but it wasn't going to sound of anything.
Yeah, I wonder, do you have any idea what was Peter's motivation? I like when you said everybody does it, so why should I, sort of thing. Because I do find, for all the reasons we're talking about, that, you know, cymbals, you want that great drum sound, even before you invented that sound, could be quite a pain in the butt. You know, you can have these cymbals, you're trying to get the rooms to come to a life, and the drummer isn't quite playing the kick and snare aggressively enough and is overplaying the cymbals. I wonder if it was, you know, did he have any kind of idea of like, I want the drums to be more prominent, to be bigger? Or was it literally just, I don't want any cymbals?
I don't know. I just think he didn't want any cymbals. But I mean, it's such a good question. I'm going to ask him the next time
Please.
I see him, because I play tennis with Peter sometimes. And so next time I see him, I'll ask that question actually again, which is a really good question. And if I get an answer, I'll email it to you.
Please. Yeah, I'm intrigued. I wonder, you know, because, yeah, it's sort of a confluence of different things that ended up creating this drum sound that pretty much, you know, became the sound of the 80s. Let's be honest. It got more and more exaggerated while people started using reverbs and gating them and not using, you know, the natural sound of the room like you were. But ultimately, it's synonymous. I mean, I've seen people creating video content, the sound of the 80s, the gated reverb. You know, it's become.
Yeah, it was very. What's the word? It was very prescient of him.
Very, yeah.
After meeting and working with Phil on Peter Gabriel's album, 6 months later, I got a call from my manager saying Tony Smith, who was Phil's manager, has rung and asked if you'd like to work with him on a solo album that he's going to do. And so I was like, oh, wow. Because you've got to remember back to this time that Phil was known as a drummer, and he had begun to sing with Genesis, and they had only just begun to have hits, a couple of hits, single hits, although, you know, musos knew them. But Phil was a drummer's drummer, and he was regarded as a serious musician. Anyway, so I went to go and meet Phil at his house, which was outside London. And I remember it was a sunny day, and I drove down in my car, and in those days he had sort of quite long hair and a beard, and we listened to some demos that he had made for the album. And his thing to me was like, well, I've written these songs because I've been really unhappy because I've split up with my wife. And I've written these songs and they're really, really not Genesis songs. And I want to record them myself because I think they're a completely different thing, and it is how I'm feeling at the moment. And I have no intention of making a record that is meant to be commercial. I just want to make a record, and I want to get really good people to play on it. And I just went, oh, wow, I mean, this is my dream come true. Not only am I working with one of the best drummers in the world, but he also wants to make a record that doesn't necessarily have to be commercial, because when you've got your producer's hat on and someone's paying you to make an album with a band that's already successful, there's a lot of pressure there.
You touched upon just how many incredible people played on this record. I mean, you've got the Earth, Wind and Fire horns as a guest artist. I mean...
Yeah, I think it's so funny looking back, because I said a minute ago that Phil, we sat down and he said, look, we can ask whoever we want. They can only say no. And I was thinking, yeah, that's great, because everybody knows you as a drummer and respects you. So it was sort of almost like, well, let's get a list of who we would like to play on the record and ask them and get them down. And that's sort of what we did. Phil had a sort of on the side band called Brand X, and basically they played music that you either hated or you loved, and it was in the most weirdest time signatures, and it was like all over the place, and stuff. So he was really into Earth, Wind and Fire. I mean, I loved their singles, I have to say, and it was all this sort of da 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 da, and completely different to the sort of like the Memphis horn sort of sound. And he just adored that, and he said, I want to get those guys to play on our record, and or my record. And so it was like, great, well, okay, let's ask them. But eventually we went to LA to do sessions and with some people over there and record the Earth, Wind and Fire guys. And it wasn't really till we were there recording them that we realized that two things. That first of all, horn sections like that was regarded as black music. And secondly, Maurice White came down to the studio, and we thought it was sort of like a whole thing of respect, and it wasn't. He was coming down because I don't know, maybe it's the way I vibed it at the time, but I don't know if this was right. He didn't like his horn section playing on a white guy's album. There was a I remember it as being a really weird vibe, and it wasn't that friendly. The guys, the horn section, loved it. They loved it. And then it wasn't till after we finished making the record that we realized or became aware of the fact that radio stations, if they heard horns on a record, they thought it was black music, and therefore we're not playing that if it's on a white AOR rock station. But I wasn't really aware of that at the time, especially not being English and not American and having no idea of segregation and whatever. But I mean, this is crazy to think this was 40 years ago and there still was that sort of thing floating around. So first of all, it was quite unique for us to be doing that sort of thing on a record like that. And so it was interesting. I mean, and obviously we carried on working with those guys for several albums. I mean, Phil never lost his obsession. And oh my God, the sessions, I can tell you, were crazy, crazy, crazy. The arranger, the guy, Phil didn't know, he can't write music or anything. So the horn parts were got together by meeting up with the arranger, who was this guy called Tom Tom 84. So if you look at Earth, Wind and Fire records, it's like horn arrangements, Tom Tom 84. Anyway, Tom Tom was they were all originally from Chicago, I think. And he's this little guy with glasses, and he don't like this, and it's like, you know, and he was a really sort of, he was a lovely guy, but very hyper. So Phil, the only way he could describe the arrangements is we would play the song, and then he would go, I want the horns to go da 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 da, like that. And so then Tom, okay, I'm going to make some notes, and he'd make his notes and then go away, and then, you know, come back in a few days or whatever it was when we had the sessions and get the band in and do it. And it was amazing how it worked. But my God, it was frightening to record because they worked and they had a sort of way of working that we sort of didn't really understand in a way. So there was things like punching in and stuff, and Tom Tom kind of he had no patience, so he just thought that we I don't know, how am I trying to describe this? It was just the sessions were quite difficult because we had to set up. Getting the sound and stuff was easy, but he was so I don't know. He it was like he had drunk sort of 24 bottles of Coca-Cola or something, and so he was like really on edge. And if you didn't do something immediately, he said. And he reduced my assistant, who was the guy who was, you know, usually doing the punch-ins, to tears, and he started shouting. And one of the few things that I did when I was young is I took music piano lessons up to grade 5, so I got my music theory. So even though I was a bit rusty, I can read music. So I ended up having to do the punching in because he was like getting you to punch in between eighth notes on like, but for like literally 3/8 notes or something. He's saying, "Hey, that wasn't on the beat properly, so we got to redo that little bit there," and it was like it was quite scary, actually, quite scary, and maybe not on that album, but on the second Hello, I Must Be Going or whatever, everybody was a bit more familiar with each other, and so he would get even more sort of frantic. All I remember was when you finished those sessions, the first thing you did was go and get a stiff whiskey or something because you were so on edge like that. But the guys were great characters. The musicians, as was Tom Tom. I mean, they were all great characters, and it was, God, I remember crying when I heard that Don, the sax player, had got he got killed by the police basically at home in LA, and anyway, that's you know, that's another story. But no, they were great, and we did some recording with them in England and some in LA. I think on the first album we did it all in LA, and because I definitely remember working at the Village, and that's when Maurice came down, and it was a bit strange, that whole vibe. And we did other bits and pieces in LA, but the brunt of it we did first mostly at the Townhouse. We had Alphonso Johnson play the bass. And I didn't know of Alphonso Johnson, but he had played in Weather Report, and my God, what an amazing bass player he was as well. And the guitar was mostly played by Daryl Sturmer, who at that point had become the sort of guitar player in Genesis, as they had Chester Thompson on drums as well when Phil was singing up front, and they had had to have an extra guitar player after they became a three-piece band. It was just amazing to be able to have whoever you wanted come down, and I mean, in that sense, Face Value is completely constructed. It's not a band playing at all anywhere on it. And it's a tribute to the record that it sounds like a record, because I'm not saying every record has to be played all the time, but I mean, with the Police, some stuff, it was all played as a backing band or whatever, but with Face Value, everything was overdubbed. But Phil and I were both really reading off the same page, and we used to have this terrible saying that's the crassest saying in the music business, which is less is more. And it's completely correct, and so we would record probably a lot more stuff than necessarily ended up on the song. And so that's how we did the record. And some of the tracks we actually used the demo for. For instance, In the Air Tonight, when we got to the studio and tried to recreate the drum sound that came off, I think it was a Roland CR78 drum box, we just couldn't, for some reason, we couldn't quite get the same sound and or tempo, because the tempo was just, you couldn't dial up a tempo. It just had a knob on the front, and who knows, it could have been the mains, it could have been the mains power, it could have been anything. We never got it to sound the same. And also, he had a Prophet 5, which was, a famous early, one of the first polyphonic synthesizers, and that's what the pad sound is behind that. And he'd fiddled around on that when he was making his demo. And we could never, it was more or less a preset, but filled with a bit, and we couldn't get that to sound the same. So I just said to him, well, why don't we just dub it onto the 24 track and go on from there? He said, are you sure we can do that? I said, yeah, why not? Come on, let's try it. And so we did it. And there were two of the sounds that didn't really matter, that they went from a second generation. And his tape recorder at home that he recorded all this stuff on was luckily a semi-pro. It was a 1-inch 8-track tape recorder made by a company called Brennell, it was quite good. And so he'd managed by luck more than anything else probably record reasonably decent level on it, which we were able to dub over to the 24 track. And so we did that with maybe 2 songs, possibly even 3. Yeah, so parts of the demo were kept, and that was nice. And I was very, very. I think Phil and I were I can't remember any of the other albums that I worked with him where it was such a sort of good feeling of a team. I think, to be honest, and I've talked to him about this before, the more when he started having sort of hits on the second and third record, because there wasn't really a single hit apart from In the Air Tonight,
Little hit,
obviously,
yeah.
which set the career off, but you couldn't keep repeating In the Air Tonight. So, on the second album, really the only hit we had on the second album was You Can't Hurry Love, which was a cover of the Supremes. And but by the third album, suddenly, he was a much bigger star. And I think towards the end of me working with him, he was getting almost too poppy for me. I wanted to go back to the sort of, the muso sort of side of it, which obviously wasn't as commercial. But the other thing I remember about Face Value that's quite fun is that one of our heroes, and Phil had got to meet him and know him quite well, was Eric Clapton. And so Phil's going, well, I've got to have Eric to come and play on the album. I mean, how much better could that be? So it's like, yeah, what a great idea. And I'd never met Eric at that point. So big day comes along and Eric's going to come down at night and play. We'd worked out that we wanted him to play on the song called The Roof is Leaking. And that song was all about, meant to be sort of sitting on a porch. And when you listen to it, we got sort of sound effects of the crickets and whatever. Anyway, Eric came down, and it was in the days before he became sober, and he probably came down about 10 or 11 o'clock at night by the time he arrived, and he was absolutely pissed. And
for Americans, that means drunk.
And Patty Boyd, his wife, was with him, and you kind of just knew it was going to be a disaster. And I remember looking at Phil and going, oh no, what are we going to do? So Eric went in the studio and we mic'd him up, and he had an acoustic and a dobro, I think, and we played the song through, but he just didn't really know where he was. I mean, I'm sure he would be fine about me talking about this now, but I remember eventually we finished and everyone went home, and then the next day I remember saying to Phil, look, I don't think we've got anything on this song that we can use at all. And so he just played little bits wherever he felt like it in the song. And nowadays you would just move them around in Pro Tools, and we didn't really have any sampling much then at all. So eventually we copied little bits onto quarter inch and flew them in. So Phil knew another guitar player called Joe Partridge, who was a good friend, and he came down and also played a few bits on it, as I think Daryl might have done as well. But so it's sort of credited as Eric plays guitar on The Roof is Leaking, but it's only really 2 or 3 little bits. And it was a bit disappointing because we were hoping that Eric was going to come and blow us away. But it was 1980, wasn't it? And I think he probably sobered up a year, or maybe, a year or 2 after that. The other guy who played lots of bits and pieces on the record was this guy called L. Shankar, who was the most amazing Indian percussionist, and he played violin and stuff as well. He was a cousin, I think, of Ravi Shankar, and he was the politest, meekest person you've ever met in your life. But he contributed some amazing stuff on the record, and everything was great. And we mixed it, and nobody bothered us from the record company much, and nobody came down and said, oh, that's going to be a single, or that isn't, as happened a bit more in those days. Now, I did several records with bands where you weren't necessarily forced into recording the single or being listened to the whole time by A&R departments and stuff. And it was really only when we came to master the record and we went to Sterling Sound in New York. We actually, I tell you how much we were into the whole thing sonically, and this is Phil as much as me, is we had it mastered in New York, which we attended, London, which we attended, and then we sent it off to LA, which we didn't attend, and we wanted to see which vinyl sounded the best out of the 3. And we actually ended up using Ted Jensen's from Sterling Sound. But while we were at Sterling Sound mastering, Ahmet Ertegun came down to listen to the record because he hadn't heard it before at all. So we had a break, and we played him the whole record. I remember sitting there quite nervously. I don't think I'd met Ahmet before that as well, but obviously he's on the list of all-time heroes of anybody in the music business, really. And he said, yeah, he used to talk like this, and he said, yeah, it's great, but I really like that song, In the Air Tonight. But it can't be a single because it's got no beat in it. It's got no beat on it, and maybe we had said we've been told that we think In the Air Tonight because of its drum thing and the surprise at the end. This would make a great single. Anyway, he said no, that I can't release that as a single. So he made us. He said, I think you should put a backbeat on it. And so we're going, oh no. And anyway, he leaves and we're going, oh no. And it was a bit of a sort of downer, really, because we were so happy with the whole album. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that we felt that we had to do what the God was asking us to do. So we went back back to England, and neither of us could face mixing the record again because it had taken a lot out of us, and we were so happy with it. So we thought, sod it. We went to, in fact, a studio called Strawberry Sound. I don't know why, but we couldn't either get into the Genesis studio or something. So we went to this studio called Strawberry Sound South that was owned by 10cc, and we literally set up some tom-toms and we overdubbed the tom-toms to the master. So we played the master back into the console. I had 2 or 3 mics on these toms, recorded the toms along to the master and re-recorded it. So basically we overdubbed onto the master, and that's what became the released single. It was never on any album, but if you listen, if anybody has ever got the actual single version of it, it would have that backbeat on, which we never really liked, but we thought we got to do it, And I think a lot of radio stations actually did play the album version of it.
It's the album version that I swear I know, but am I wrong? Was it in the UK? Which version did they play?
Well, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. We'd have to ask the powers that be, because I only really relate it to the. That's why we were quite disdainful about the idea. It was like, oh, we can't be bothered with it, so we'll just overdub onto the mix that we like. So that single release of it lost a generation in terms of the drum sound and everything else. But there you go. I don't know. I just don't really remember radio stations playing that version of it. Might only have been in America. Who knows?
So for In the Air Tonight, you've had Phil specifically gone in with that in mind after having the experience of Melt on Intruder, that he was going to have a song like that where he could really showcase that huge drum sound?
Yeah. I think the whole experience of the Intruder, which was kind of what ended up with me working with Phil on that album, because he was, luckily for me, he was rather impressed and thought it was all very good. So going to In the Air Tonight, I think he had the song, the demo, which obviously didn't have any drums on, and who it must have been his idea. Oh, let's have the drums coming in at the end, and then it's like, let's scare the shit out of people because they won't be expecting it. As has recently become famous from these twins, the twins in the video that went viral because they had never heard the song before. So I think, we definitely did it for shock value. And the big problem with mixing the song was how could we get the drums to sound loud enough for when they came in to be arresting, but for the beginning of the song not to sound too quiet. And so we didn't mix it in an hour, put it like that. We spent a long time, even though that drum sound is loud even when it's soft, but we still wanted the boost to be there. And we were messing around with it, even including the mastering as well, with the problem of actually getting it onto vinyl as well without the needle jumping out the groove and all that sort of thing. Up until the solid state Logic SSL system came on board, we used the very early automated mixing was usually done through this thing called an Allison 65K. Do you remember that at all? It was like
never got to use
very early VCA fader automation, and you had to use 2 tracks of the multi-track. So it would record its own proprietary information from the faders onto a track, and then when you updated that, it basically went onto the second track, and then you played the second track back and bounced that back onto the first track, and so you built your mix up that way. But it was very unreliable in the sense that you didn't tend to notice it too much on fader moves, but on things like cuts, it would move during the process of a few hours mixing. So if you put cuts in, you normally had to redo them at the end of the mix. And looking back on it now, it was very prehistoric in a way. So when the SSL system came out, this was like absolutely amazing how different it was and how sort of real and professional it sounded. And I hadn't made any provision for this while we were recording Peter's record. Nowadays, you go, okay, well, I'm not recording anything on track 24 because that's where the SMPTE code is going to go. And so over the course of 6 months or whatever it was we took to make the record, we had stuff all over the tape. And when we realized it was going to be an awful lot easier to mix it using computer help with mutes and fader levels, then it was like, oh God, I've got to find a track to put things on. And so I really remember this. It ended up being track 17 because track 17 seemed to be the track that had the least important stuff on it. So I either bounced it down somewhere else. And because, sonically we were obsessed with not sort of having to bounce things down too much and lose quality, because we were sore enough in those days having to work 24 track anyway, because as far as we were concerned 16 tracks sounded a lot better. But I didn't want to record the time code on different tracks on different songs because I thought that would get really crazy. So we ended up using track 17, which is a bit strange. Of course you wouldn't do that now, and we never did it afterwards. But it reminded me of that was literally the first. I'm absolutely sure it was the first record I ever mixed using the SSL computer.
That's amazing. That sort of leads me to, because you're at this period where the first samplers starting to come in, really early digital stuff. And as you're pointing out, everything is syncing via SMPTE. It was probably would have been incredibly exciting having access to all of these different things. I remember talking to Bob specifically about this and him saying, whenever there was a new box, you just had to get the new box to try it out, whether it be a new reverb, a new, something that you could have. Did you?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, we in the early 80s, even though we're talking about this, you're talking about this period that had sonic amazingness from analog, and perhaps analog equipment had reached its zenith by that point, or
I
however
think
you
so,
want
yeah.
to describe it.
Yeah.
We were totally and utterly into digital. We thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. I was actually one of the first guys to ever actually buy a Sony 1610 two-track recorder, which had to have this 3/4-inch U-matic video recorder to record all the stuff onto. And that would have been 84 probably. But even before that, any new box that came out we were into, but particularly instruments as well, because if you remember rightly, the Prophet 5, which was the famous one that we used on In the Air Tonight for the sort of pad sound, that was one of the first polyphonic synthesizers. Well, there weren't polyphonic synthesizers before that. It was like mini Moogs or Moogs, and it was all sort of, it was all mono. So to have these, the other one that was a Yamaha DX7, do you remember that?
Oh, very well. Yes, very well.
I mean, that was the pretty well the first sort of I remember it had an amazing sort of acoustic guitar plucked sound in the presets, and it was like, wow, this is incredible. So yeah, and digital reverbs and things like that. We were like, oh wow, this is amazing, and give us more. I mean, we were hungry for all that new stuff. I mean, suckers for it. It's quite funny looking at that magazine that I was showing you before, because it's got all the early Mitsubishi X850 32-track digital machine. I actually recorded an album digitally in 1981, I think it was. I did a album with Frida, the red-headed girl from ABBA, with Phil Collins, and we went to Sweden to their studio, which was an amazing studio called Polar Studios. And they had, I think it was a 3M digital machine. I think it was just 24-track. It was terrible, absolutely terrible. I don't know how we managed to get through a whole album using it. And funnily enough, we ended up with a hit in America called There's Something Going On. But it was my first instance of actually recording onto digital and finding out how much a nightmare it was. But I certainly went straight, but I don't think I did a digital multi-track recording until much later on. I couldn't stand the sound of I didn't like the sound of the Mitsubishi much. The Sony 3324 I didn't like. And eventually the 48-track version of that came out. And it cost a fortune, but it sounded a bit better, but not that great. And then when I did, I think Sting's solo album called 10 Sumner's Tales, and we bought a 3348, and we were doing it at his house in the country. And every time you wanted to do an edit, you had to use two machines to edit. Do you remember? Same with the 2-track stuff before. And so we'd finish a session, and my poor assistant, we'd want to do an edit, and my poor assistant would have to drive all the way up to London to go to wherever it was to edit this thing, to then come back and carry on the next day. It was a nightmare. So in the end, Sting said, oh, I'll just buy another one then. And we managed, a new one then was about £250,000.
Wow.
And we managed to, I know. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it?
It's
absolutely crazy. And we managed to buy Sony's demo machine for something like £180,000. So we had two machines in the same room. Oh my God.
£180,000 then
digital
was a very nice house.
Oh yeah. But I mean, when you look at studio recording costs then, you can understand how the whole business, studio business, imploded in a way, because it was just, I don't know, in the mid to late 80s, it was probably £2,000 a day to use the main studio at the townhouse. Well,
doesn't take many days before you've used up your whole budget for an album now. So you can see how and why it's changed, you know. I mean, a reel of tape. Well, when we did our jazz record the other day, we used this stuff called recording the masters. There's not that many people who make analog tape anymore. And that's nearly £400 a reel.
Wow.
You know, and nowadays, if you started putting that into the budget, and, you know, I mean, we used to use tens. I mean, you know, be quite easy to use 40, 50 rolls of tape on an album in those days. Outtakes, this, that, and the other. You didn't really think about it, you know. And I was also lucky, you know, the kind of guys who I was working with, whether it would be the Police or Genesis or Phil Collins, there wasn't a budget, you know. It's like whatever the record cost is what it cost. Because they were pretty confident that at the end of the day it was going to sell, you know, 10 million plus, hopefully. It's just so, it's all different, isn't it?
I think you covered this earlier, by saying now the converters are infinitely better. But there was that interview you did with Paul, where you in '98, which is, I suppose, you know, as Pro Tools started to become something that you'd see in most studios at the beginning of it. So do you really feel now that the converters now are, you know, optimal so that you can preserve the quality that you love from analog?
Well, I would answer that with the word probably, because I'm not doing enough recording nowadays to check it all out. I remember when I had the which is probably 15 years ago now. I'm sure they got better ones out now, but the last lot of Apogee ones, and it had this soft limit button on it, which was designed to try and just round off. You know, if you look at a snare drum transient, it just goes on forever, doesn't it? And I would have thought nowadays it's probably even better, but I don't have the experience. And I mean, I am a bit of an old Luddite in that sense, partly because this gearbox stuff that I do now, we on purpose, if we can, do everything old school. Like the disc mastering room that we run is an old Westrex lathe, and it's all valve amplifiers, or tube amplifiers as you call them in America. And so we purposely do everything old school, which keeps the Luddite in me sort of satisfied, I suppose, because I'm the kind of guy who I still cannot get hold of, say, a UA 1176, which is my favorite compressor of all time, I think, and which I've used all my life, you know, 40 more years of recording. You put the latest version on a computer screen of it that's done, and for me it still doesn't sound the same as when I've got two hands on the buttons or the knobs turning them. And they everybody says it is great, and I'm sure it is, but I can't even mix in the box. I just can't. I can't get it together moving faders up with a mouse, and I can move 3 or 4, if not 4 or 5 faders with my two hands together, and you can only do one at a time with a mouse. I literally can't get my head around it. But again, that's probably because I've not done enough of it. Do you mix in the box now?
I decide on the project whether I want to make it sound like what you can get in the box, or still most of the time I mix what you would call hybrid. So I'm using plugins and moves inside of the box, but I'm outputting everything through the console. You know, it's still, we have a 40-channel SSL, and I'm probably using 36 channels at all time, and the returns for effects and everything. So I think hybrid
Yeah,
is,
it's
for
great.
me, is the best compromise. And not the best compromise, that's the wrong way
Yeah.
of putting it. It's actually the best of all worlds.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally and utterly get why you do it in the box or whatever, because to be able to come back next week and not have some assistant looking at his photographs that he'd taken of the EQ or something to try and get it in the right place, and or whatever it is, the outboard gear or whatever. It's great to be able to just press a button and there it is, and somebody wants you, some ghastly record company man wants you to do something that you don't agree with, and you go, all right, well, there you go, and you can do it without the pain that it used to be. I remember, funnily enough, talking about that, we did one of the Phil Collins solo records, second or third one in the 80s, and we were a bit confident, really, with ourselves. And in those days, you always used to do vocal up, vocal down, no vocal, all these different mixes. And so we thought, oh, can't we bother to do that? We were really pleased with what we'd done, and we thought that's the mix and that's it. So we did vocal up mix, vocal down mix, but they were exactly the same mix. And no one ever said anything. Obviously, we did backing track mix as well, but in terms of vocal levels, the vocal up mix was exactly the same.
And I feel pretty assured that that nobody at the label noticed.
You know about the DFA fader as well, don't you?
Yes.
You know what a DFA fader is?
I know. I mean, know what you're implying, although I don't know what the acronym stands for in this instance. But we used to call it the A&R fader. Yes, I know. What does the DFA stand for?
Does fuck all. So you get the producer. He wanted to ride the vocal. So you'd say, look, I'm going to give you a fader right next to you because it's going to be easier. So you give them the fader that just didn't do anything. Always worked.
I won't ask you which producers you did that to. Don't want to incriminate the guilty.
To be honest, that's how I started producing, because I got really fed up with sitting next to blokes in, all who will remain nameless, but, sitting next to so-called producers, some of them quite well known, as engineer at the Townhouse, going, oh, what's he doing? This is embarrassing, him talking to the artist or something like that. And so I actually got to, because I was starting to, engineer decent records like with XTC and stuff like that. So I asked this guy called Simon Draper, who was the one who actually ran the music side of Virgin Records in those days. He was a cousin of Richard Branson's. And I said, Simon, I really, really think I can produce just as well, and it would cost you half as much if you didn't pay a producer. You paid me, I'll engineer it as well. And, I think it will be great. And so he actually gave me a couple of what I call Virgin Junior bands, bands that weren't, big or whatever. And so I did do 2 or 3 EPs, all for Virgin, on my own engineering. It was a bit scary to start with, actually, because even though I think now I can sort of engineer pretty well with my eyes closed, but it's not always that easy. And doing that and having the responsibility of, was that a good take or not? Oh, I don't know, because I was looking at the VU meters to see if I was, not putting enough level on tape or something, you know what I mean? And so it was something that really, it was quite a good experience to do it for a few bands before I then, lucked out by meeting Phil Collins and being asked to do stuff like that. So I kind of, went in at the deep end pretty quickly, really, which was, it was cool.
Now, you produced and engineered. Is there still a part of you that in the perfect world you get to do both because they're sort of inextricably linked? Or now that you've made so many great records, do you prefer the production role?
Oh, well, in terms of producing and engineering, even if I'm in the studio supposedly producing, I still like to keep my fingers on the knobs. And the one thing which I find extremely difficult to do is working in the box. And so I'll always have an engineer or assistant or whatever who is actually doing all the Pro Tools. I mean, I can basically wind back to the beginning of a Pro Tools song and play it, and that's about it. I mean, I can do very basic editing and stuff, but I'm not like one of these wizards. So I still love working on analog consoles. I have to say, I hardly ever make records now in the same sense of the records we've been talking about, because in a way those days are dead and gone. Well, in my terms, they are. I think you don't get the budgets to be able to record in that sort of way now, and also I think I got kind of, without sounding awful, I kind of got bored of the whole regime of taking months to make records, and if I have to do another vocal comp, it will drive me mad. And so I think I can't remember if I said to you or not, but I'm involved in a small jazz label now. And we very much obsessed with sound quality and all this. And I've just made a record with a young, very, very good musicians jazz band. And we did 3 days at Rack Studios in London, recording on the API console there. And then we did 2 days mixing at British Grove Studios on their API console with very basic Uptown fader automation. And the record was made in 5 days. I keep my chops up in terms of engineering. Production-wise, well, with jazz, there's much less production because it's more sort of produced in the arrangement of the songs, which kind of, I don't know, in the jazz world, you don't have so much to do with. So my life's changed a lot in that. And I do miss the big time stuff in a way, but in many ways I don't. And if I just think back to Synchronicity, then I go, no, I don't miss it at all. And so I like to keep my engineering chops together, which is great. So
no, I love it, and I love that answer
question.
because, of course, what we're talking about here is everything coming together. We keep highlighting great songwriting, incredible musicianship with the production, and more importantly, the recording, how it was actually captured and how those sounds were sculpted and inspired people.
Yeah, English Settlement was quite early on in my production career, I suppose. Although I had done Ghost in the Machine with the Police and Phil, I suppose I had done Face Value with, but I just loved XTC. I mean, they were really such a favourite band of mine. And having done 2 albums with them, we kind of knew each other quite well. And so we went up to the Manor and we did the whole thing up at the Manor, and it was a fantastic experience. And we'd just built a live drum room up at the Manor. Before that, it was quite a dead studio, and we'd managed, because of the success of Studio 2 at the Townhouse, the Stone Room as it's called, we persuaded Virgin to build a room on the back of the studio. So that was the first record I'd made there that we were able to use the live drum room. And it was just really good fun, even though I read it more than knew it at the time. Andy was struggling with his I don't know, mental health, I suppose. It had got to the stage where he really, really hated being on the road. and I think previous albums had been recorded very much with the idea of playing the songs on the road, so they would sound like the studio recordings. So there was not usually very much stuff on Drums and Wires and Black Sea that couldn't be reproduced live. And I think on English Settlement, I think Andy had almost sort of, although he didn't talk about it, had thought about in his mind, I don't really care about that attitude anymore because I'm actually not going to be playing on the road anymore. And so the album was quite different from the previous 4 albums that were really a sort of, I never really liked using the word post-punk, but they were that sort of guitar type band. And there was much more sort of esoteric type stuff on English Settlement, although there were some good guitar stuff as well. I adore that song, No Thugs in My House. I think that's great.
Song. Looking at the track listing here, it's pretty incredible. I mean, it starts off with Runaways, the whoa, runner. Oh, I mean, the vocal sound on that, the way it just comes in. And I love the way that sound blends. You got the whoa, run away. Just, it's so melodic. XTC, you talk about the post-punk thing, and I totally understand it's where they came from, especially the first, what was the first album? Was it Go To? Was it what it was called? Before you? And that was very sort of...
That's when they had Barry Andrews as the keyboard player. Right. That was before Dave Gregory.
Right.
The first album that Dave Gregory played on was Drums and Wires.
Oh, well. But
and that was the first time I worked with the band.
It was, I mean, they feel like they have a healthy dose of Beatles mixed in there. It feels like to me that Andy and Colin feel like they listened to all of the greatest songwriting bands ever, and they were just, I feel the same way with the Police almost. Like, they came out of a sort of post-punk time, so they're being relevant, and then suddenly they get enough success to sort of break the chains and just make the records that they want to make.
Yeah. The thing is, with English Settlement, there was, well, 2 things really. First, Colin had become known as the sort of almost like the hit writer, because he wrote Life Begins at the Hop, which was never on an album, which was Colin singing. That was a semi-hit in England. And then he wrote Making Plans for Nigel. And then he had whatever other songs it was on those records. And then with English Settlement, he really sort of came to the fore in a way. And I don't know, that probably pissed off Andy to an extent. But I mean, you talk about Runaways, that's Colin singing. Mm-hmm. Second song on the album is Ball and Chain, that's Colin as well. When I was listening through to the record the other day, his bass playing is unbelievably good. It's just incredible. And he plays more fretless bass on this album as well. And, he was, I didn't realize it at the time, I don't think, but his bass playing is just incredibly, incredibly good. And I don't compare it to Paul McCartney, but in the sort of melodic sense that he plays, is, similar to the sense that, McCartney sort of invented a whole new sort of genre of bass playing in a way, didn't he, I think?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that's a real remarkable thing. And then just digressing back to a technical level for a second, 2 things. First of all, it was all recorded on a Helios desk at the Manor. And the Helios desk was, for people who don't know, it's a small English company. I mean, I'm sure you know all about them. But who basically made handmade desks like Neve, but they were probably never made in as many quantities as Neve consoles. They were made by this guy who was originally at Olympic Studios called Dick Swettenham, who worked before Olympic at EMI. So all these people come from very sort of high quality audio backgrounds from the early 60s, basically. Anyway, the Helios desk at the Manor sounded fantastic. It was a really, really good sounding desk. And I put, some of the fact that, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but it does sound great, that album coming out.
Sounds phenomenal.
I'm sure a lot of it was the Helios desk. Secondly, the Ampex MM1200 tape recorder, which sounded great. I think they sounded better than the Studer recorders, and at that time Virgin Studios had all Ampex tape recorders. And also when I worked with the Police and in Montserrat, they had MCI 24 tracks, which I think were a kind of copy in a way electronically of the Ampex recorders. So the equipment at the Manor was really second to none in terms of the high quality, I think, and I'm sure that has a bearing on the sound in a way. Hopefully my perfect expertise of mic placement and stuff as well, but
well, it's the ears. That's ultimate, isn't it? You put the mic in the right place, or potentially the wrong place could be the right place if you have an understanding of how you want
exactly.
it to be.
We all I had this very formal education, as I think audio education, as I think we were talking about in the last interview a bit, and so it's kind of nice to know how to do things properly, but it's great to be able to abuse things as well, and that's what we all loved about the mic amps, the Neve mic amps, is they would distort so nicely, and all that sort of thing. So abusing the equipment is just as important as using it. I think but it's good to know both ways,
I feel like a characteristic, at least in my humble opinion, a characteristic of a Helios is a very sort of upfront sound. I almost feel like when you hit them hard, there's like an extra level of almost compression. They just feel like they're pushing really super forward.
So other favourite records of mine, like Rolling Stones' Beggar's Banquet, which is one of my all-time favourite records, was recorded at Olympic, and that was all done on a Helios desk. And they had the several Helios desks at Olympic, and a lot of incredible albums that were recorded at Olympic in the late 60s were all done through Helios desks. I listened to I've got a set up in my office here at home with just little speakers, but quite good little desktop speakers. And I'm listening basically off iTunes. And so I started playing English Settlement that I would have imported into iTunes probably 15, if not 20 years ago now, when iTunes first came out and we all went mad and had an iPod and put all our stuff into it. And I'm listening through to the album, and I'm going, it's really weird. Why did I mix the vocals so low? They don't really sound very loud at all. And so I started messing around with the EQ a bit, which you can do on a basic version, just that's in iTunes or whatever. And then I thought, well, this just doesn't sound right. So I then streamed it off Apple Music. I've got Apple Music and Spotify. And I streamed it off Apple Music, and it immediately sounded better, like much better. The vocals I could hear rather than them sounding buried. So it's really interesting to me, in a way the same as when cassettes first came out, even though they were analog, if they were badly recorded, the sound could be absolutely horrendous. And I think it's the same thing with digital, really. I mean, when CDs first came out, you didn't know if they were mastered off the master or off some safety copy that a secretary at the record company couldn't be bothered to find the master or couldn't find the master or something. So they just did it off the safety copy. And in those days, safety copies never sounded as good as if it was a copy off the master. It would never sound as good. And so it really started making me think about how careful you have to be with digitally reproducing stuff, and whether my CD was put into when I imported it into the Mac. That would have been a Mac from nearly 20 years ago, and its conversion was probably not nearly as good as now. So it's amazing how records, especially if you've made them yourself, because you're aware of how it is or how it should sound, and how incredibly different it can sound off different mediums, and how it messes with the balance and things like that.
Yeah, there's so many potential things that can go wrong, when you're streaming. Bandwidth and all kinds of horrible things. I mean,
yeah,
I agree with you on the cassette thing. I never really, when I moved to America in the mid 90s, there was still an obsession with cassettes, and people would tell me, they put cassettes on in. I don't think we had that in the UK. I don't think people were really into cassettes. People bought them, but not in droves, like they did over here. As a kid, I could tell a massive difference between a vinyl album and a cassette immediately. When you got those young ears with incredible top end, you put it on and go, "Oh, this sounds awful." And it's interesting that convenience as a medium always wins, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Well, exactly. I mean, look what happened to MP3s, I find the analogy, just very quickly, amazing that in the 50s, I'm talking an analogy between audio and video here. In the 50s, you had black and white TV with hardly any lines on the screen. And so gradually through the 60s, and then color came along, and then in the late 60s, and then more lines, and now then we had HD, and then 4K, and now they're talking 8K, and it's got better and better and better. And my best TV downstairs has got, I think, a pretty damn good picture. And yet with audio, you've gone from LPs, vinyl, 33 and a third, that we love the sound of still, basically from mid 50s or whenever they came out to early 80s. Then it went to CDs, which we all thought was not as good sounding, although in a way we were all conned into, well, they're great because they don't scratch like a record does, so we don't have the crackling and all that. Okay, that may be true, but the sound quality, there's a physical filter cut off at half the sampling rate, which is 22.05K. And we all know that analog machines are flat up to 40, 50K, even though you can't hear it, you feel it. And that's one reason why CDs just something isn't quite right with them. And then you went from CDs to MP3s, which is like even worse. And yet memory has become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because the constraint was usually memory, and memory was expensive. And it's just weird that video has got better and better and better, and audio, for me, has got worse and worse and worse.
Yes.
Shouldn't be like that. I mean, if you're recording in the studio at 96K, 24-bit, or even 192, that does sound pretty damn good, I have to say, but for the reasons I just described, why CDs don't. So, but then does anybody care about the sound of records anymore anyway? I don't know. And most people stream. I mean, I would say 80% of the music I listen to is probably streamed onto a Bluetooth box in the kitchen when you're cooking or whatevering. It's rare, unless I'm actually in the studio, that I'm sat in front of a pair of really good quality speakers with a fantastic amp and all that, you know. And I think people probably design and make records to sound how they sound on these mediums, you know, i.e. the Bluetooth boombox.
I think we got used to this sort of golden period we're talking about in the sort of late 70s through to sort of the mid 80s. This where everything was the Beatles was still a massive influence, so everybody wanted to write incredible songs. Musicianship was still really held up super high, and of course production was considered to be like it was at the peak of production. We got used to the music that we love being popular, like top of the pops popular, like top 40 music. I mean, on this album alone, Senses working overtime, I watched it on Top of the Pops when I was a kid, and I remember being a little kid watching it thinking, did he just say says he's working overtime? You know. But my point is like these were pop songs. This was an album that now you listen to and it's a masterpiece of production and a masterpiece of songwriting, but we can't forget that these songs were selling hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies. And I think that's one of the things that we're sort of coming up against now, because I think people still want to and do make great music. It's just not in the top 40 anymore. So there isn't a drive and the money's not behind supporting the music, you know, this quality of music.
Yeah. You know, the one thing you can't change in life is change. And so, you know, I feel very lucky to have worked in that era.
Amazing, yeah.
But you can't regret it, and you have to, you just have to get on with it, you know, and I mean, I do get asked questions from students and kids and so on, and people are obsessed or whatever with the 70s and 80s thing, and you go, well, you know, I'm sorry, but you can't reproduce that sound because the equipment, everything's different, you know, and you just got to get on with it, and because that's what we were doing at the time. Any bit of new gear that came out, we were totally enthralled by it and stuff. So don't get too sentimental about things. But I mean, I love talking about it, and as I say, I'm very appreciative and lucky that I was able to do, you know, what I did when I did it. Really,
That's incredible.
What I remember talking about synthesizers was that the band never really had any money at all, and they certainly didn't. It was those awful days, I hate to say, where the band was signed to Virgin on their record label and also signed to their publishing company, which nowadays no manager would let happen, and no record label would probably want that, but anymore. But in those days, it was one of the things. If you wanted to, you know, Richard Branson, if you wanted to sign to Virgin and release a record, then we want your publishing as well, please. And there was a cross collateralization thing between the two. So in those days, you were more likely to make money from record sales than you were from touring. I mean, it's the other way around now. But in those days, if you had a big record, then a big record was, you know, could potentially be millions, and that would help pay for the touring if you were trapped into these contracts. And so basically, XTC were just making no money. They were trapped because it was either going one way or the other way and going into a hole. And in a way, like a lot of bands of that time, they were quite naive in terms of their business dealings, and their manager was quite naive as well. So what I'm trying to say is the synth sounds you've got on English Settlement are played off a very cheap Korg synthesizer that I think they found as a demonstration model in a music shop in Swindon. So it probably cost 100 quid or 200 quid or something. There was no fancy Moogs or Oberheims or anything, but they were so creative as a band, or Andy and Dave Gregory, who tended to play the synth parts. They would find, a way to make it sound great, and we'd maybe put it through something or whatever. So I really like all the textures of the synthesizer sounds on that record, and they all coming from like the cheapest one synthesizer.
One synth.
And I think Dave Gregory bought a 12-string guitar. I think he bought a Rickenbacker 12-string. He is really into guitars. He actually had a really good collection, and I think literally he would eat baked beans on toast for a year just to save money to buy up a nice Gibson 335 or something. So he had a few nice guitars, and Andy, he had a Gibson Les Paul, I think, which was pretty flash for him. And then I think he had a Yamaha electric guitar. So he tended to play often the more sort of, what do you call them, double coil pickup sort of sounds, the more sort of distorted stuff. And Dave would have his Fender Strat or his 12-string and stuff. So there was, there wasn't masses and masses of equipment hanging around. And I think Colin only just bought a fretless bass for that album as well.
Oh, wow. Thanks ever so much. Hope you enjoyed that. If you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. And of course, if you're into production, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, adio, tschüss. Goodbye.